Hello and welcome to this training entitled Returning to a New Normal. My name is Dawn Starley and I'm an educational psychologist working for Somerset County Council. This training was written in response to schools seeking some guidance on how best to prepare for the return to school after the changes imposed by the Covid-19 emergency response. It is really pleasing to hear that, in particular, what schools are wanting is some guidance around how best to support the emotional well-being of their school community following this international crisis experience. The title of the training reflects the recognition that what we are returning to may not feel like normal for some time and may never return to the normal we experienced before all the Covid-19 changes. That, along with experiences during the lockdown, can be particularly hard for some people. Some children will find it hard to return to life as normal when lockdown ends, but schools can help them to adjust and to heal from their experiences if needed. We're not yet clear about when schools will open for all children, but the one certainty we have is that they will need to be therapeutic in some way. But this does not mean transforming classrooms into clinics or teachers into psychotherapists. What we'll need is a whole school approach where we're using the same understanding and language with our young people and each other, so it feels like a supportive place to be. So this training is aimed at anyone working in an education setting who wants to consider how best to support not only their pupils, but their own well-being when trying to get back to some sense of normality after such a significant period of upheaval. The training lasts around an hour and a half, and I've tried to include a range of theory and interactive tasks. So although you will see the presentation is around an hour recorded, there's around half an hour of activities in addition to that. Clearly, this is a pre-recorded piece of training, which is a new and different way of doing things. So although you can't interact with me directly, you can pause the presentation as you need and make notes or jot down any questions you might have. It also means you can take a comfort break whenever you need by just pausing and restarting the presentation. Or you can just watch through the whole presentation without pausing to do the activities, although they will help you to understand some of the points I'll be making and bring the training a bit more to life. My contact details are at the end of the presentation if you have any comments or questions following the training you would like any further clarity with. This is part 1 of 2 training sessions. This is theory, and then next we'll focus on practical strategies and interventions for you to use in school. And my thanks go to Guy Clayton, who was involved in the early stages of developing this training. Before we start, I should be clear that we will be talking at different points about the Covid-19 response, trauma and anxiety. Please be mindful of your own health and well-being throughout, and if you're finding something distressing or triggering in any way, please take responsibility for your own self-care and pause or stop the presentation and speak with your colleagues or line manager if needed. There are 3 aims of this training and how you will know if it's been a successful session for you. First, you will hopefully have an awareness of the likely impact of the Covid-19 response, both for yourselves and your pupils. We know some children, young people and families will have found this period harder than others. Some you may be able to predict, others you may not. Second, I'm hoping you will feel a greater sense of confidence to return to your setting and get back to normality as much as possible. Third, you will have a greater sense of control over how you can support your pupils. Hopefully you'll finish the training believing we all have more control than we think we do over our lives and what happens next. So, how are we going to do all that? Here's what to expect from the next hour or so. First, we will briefly talk about where we are now, naming what has happened and what is likely to happen next. We will go on to learn a bit about trauma and ways in which this might come about and show itself. In relation to this, we will look at the theory of self-efficacy and how this relates to traumatic experiences. We will then talk more specifically about anxiety and ways in which this presents itself. Linked to this, we will look at the concept of resilience and why this will be a key focus going forwards. The final bit of theory will introduce CBT, cognitive behaviour therapy, and look at why this is such a powerful tool in overcoming anxiety. All of this will lay the groundwork for the next training session, which is all about practical strategies for supporting emotional well-being. So just to begin, a snapshot of the past couple of months and likely few months ahead. In doing so in such a brief way, I don't want to minimise anything that has happened, but instead validate the pace at which things have changed for us all in our country, and highlight the key events as relevant to education and the young people we work with. The first cases of coronavirus, Covid-19, were confirmed in the UK on the last day of January this year. The number of cases rose, and the first British person to die of the illness was at the end of February, a man on a cruise ship. On March the 5th, an elderly lady died of the illness in the UK, and from that point, the number of people infected and dying from the condition has been rising to the figure we are at today, which at the time of producing this presentation was in the tens of thousands. Restrictions on travel started to come into place at the end of January, and towards the end of February, the government advised self-isolation for those people who had travelled to certain countries. On March the 3rd, the government action plan stated a severe prolonged pandemic. Days later, £46 million was put towards research into a vaccine and diagnostic tests, and the Prime Minister stated that it looks like there will be a substantial period of disruption where we have to deal with this outbreak. By March the 16th, we were having daily coronavirus news broadcasts. The advice increased to no non-essential travel and contact with others, and working from home where possible. Non-urgent hospital operations were being postponed, and the Chancellor released funds to support businesses to stay afloat. By the 20th of March, a hospital in Harrow declared a critical incident due to the surge of patients with coronavirus, and the government ordered cafes, pubs and restaurants to close. Public events were postponed, including local elections, sporting events, festivals, and of perhaps greatest significance for us, schools were ordered to close, except for the most vulnerable children and the children of key workers. By late March, we were hearing about the deaths of these key workers on the front line. Parents were suddenly expected to homeschool their children, very different from elective home education. By the 22nd of March, ex-healthcare workers were coming back onto the front line to offer their services. On the 23rd of March, the restrictions became a UK-wide lockdown with immediate effect in an attempt to contain the spread of the virus and protect the NHS from further critical incidents. On the 24th of March, for the first time ever, we get a text message from the government telling us we must stay at home. On March the 31st, research by Sheffield and Ulster universities was revealed to show a significant rise in anxiety and depression among the UK population following the lockdown. And on the 8th of April, around 9 million workers were furloughed. By mid-April, the Health Secretary announced new guidelines to say that close family members could see dying relatives in order to say goodbye to them. The lockdown is extended a further 3 weeks, and diagnostic testing is to be rolled out to cover more frontline staff. On April the 18th, we found out that many more care home residents may have died of coronavirus than was being shared in the media, with the Health Secretary assuring us that more accurate figures would be reported in future. On the 28th of April, there was a minute's silence to remember the key workers who have died from Covid-19, including education staff. By the end of April, we were reportedly past the peak and were told lockdown measures may be reduced, but to beware of a second spike in the infection and death rate. The social media accounts of conspiracy theorists claiming Covid-19 was caused by 5G were officially removed. At the start of May, £76 million was released to help vulnerable people, including children, victims of domestic violence and modern slavery, who may be trapped in a nightmare during the lockdown restrictions. The latest news at time of writing was a slight shift in the message to stay alert and a plan to reduce lockdown gradually, with some primary school pupils potentially returning to school in June if the virus has become more under control. Meanwhile, there have been plummets in the financial sector, the collapse of airline companies, panic buying and resulting shortages of essential items, soap opera movie filming and the Premier League on hold, workers redeployed, disputes over whether children of separated parents could spend time with both parents, a rare public broadcast by the Queen, resignation of government officials and scientific advisors due to hypocritical behaviour, the Health Secretary, Prince Charles and our Prime Minister all testing positive for Covid-19, Boris Johnson of course hospitalised with contingency plans made in case of his death. He then returned to work. We all have increased awareness of PPE, ventilators, people in care homes, access for some people to second homes, and a heightened appreciation for the NHS and key workers. Apologies if I've missed anything key off there that you think should have been included. I think what I have noted indicates the huge amount that has happened in such a short time, some of it of more significance than others to the members of our school community. I couldn't go any further without saying thank you to you, school staff, as key workers throughout this, and including this famous quotation you may be familiar with from children's TV host Fred Rogers. Fred Rogers often told this story about when he was a boy and would see scary things on the news. My mother would say to me, "Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping." To this day, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words, and I am always comforted by realizing that there are still so many helpers, so many caring people in this world. This has been a helpful reminder over this period of time where the news can be incredibly frightening and depressing for people. We have had, in many places and in many forms, such community spirit and national effort to support one another. In fact, one of the top pieces of advice for maintaining your mental health over this period has been to watch less news. It can be very biased in favour of the distressing rather than uplifting information. Thanks again to you for remaining present for our most vulnerable children and children of key workers. Your work really is important. So what are we expecting over the next couple of weeks and months? We will at some point be getting back into schools. Whether that will be staggered in some way or all at once is unclear. For some of us, there will have been bereavements and other forms of loss. Some of these may have been quite sudden and out of our control. For many of us, there may have been significant changes in our living routines, our work lives, our social lives, our family lives. For some, there will have been an impact on access to food and amenities, to play and recreation. Normality as we knew it has changed in some way for everyone. We need to give ourselves time and opportunity to process these things. Be kind to yourself over the coming month. You have been through a lot in some way or other. If you've been able to find positives in your experiences, brilliant. Some people may have had the time and opportunity to try out new hobbies or learn new skills, to relax and have time to reflect. Others won't have done, and that is okay. Some of us will be returning to work completely exhausted, having had a total merging of our home and work lives, or had to balance enforced homeschooling with anxieties over family health and reduced income. Not everyone will be coming back refreshed and reinvigorated. Partly it is about recognising that our experience of lockdown may not have been the same as our colleagues. What will happen next for all of us is transitioning to a new normal. This is a key phrase used in the grief and recovery world to help people move forwards with their lives after significant change or loss. Within your school community, there will likely be the full range of experiences from minor changes or losses to the most severe. The final thing to consider over the next few months is the notion of adversarial growth. We know the powerful healing potential of a community, and the school community is an excellent example of this. The attitudes brought to the return to education can help shift pandemic destruction to value, strength, and growth. Adversarial growth is about drawing meaning from chaos. It means that things can be better than they were before, as the school community will be more resilient and you will have made meaning from the adversary. Before we make a start on the theory, I'd like you to just consider two things for me. What are you most worried about in going back to school? And what are you most looking forward to? If you'd like to pause the presentation for a few moments to consider these things and jot down your answers. It may be helpful if you can find the opportunity to share your answers with your colleagues. Do any of them feel the same way? Are there things you can do to ease your worries? Are there plans you can make to look forward to things together? Let's now go on to talk about how we can understand and manage the experiences we and our young people have had over the past few months, starting at the most extreme end, trauma. What is trauma? There are many definitions out there. For the sake of this training, let's consider trauma to be an experience that is psychologically overwhelming. An activity for you to do if you feel okay to do so. Can you think of ways in which the past few months may have been experienced as traumatic for some of your young people? Again, just spend a couple of moments thinking about this, then return to the presentation. Trauma is something that we have a much better understanding of than we did even just a few decades ago. Where traumatic responses would previously be minimised, denied, ridiculed, or have other stigmatising associations made, we now know that open discussion of trauma with no stigma usually results in people dealing better with it. So on top of the perhaps more expected traumas of the Covid-19 pandemic, fear and anxiety over loss, separation and bereavement, there are also some secondary risks being considered by those, such as us in educational psychology, working with vulnerable families. As a result of the enforced lockdown and reduced contact with professionals, there are heightened concerns around the effects of poverty, homelessness, domestic abuse, child exploitation, modern slavery and radicalisation. Some of those young people with special educational needs may have found the lockdown particularly challenging, adjusting to the change, a reduction in their typical interventions, no or limited contact with their peers or key adults, maybe limited understanding about what is happening and why, and families having no access to respite, which can place considerable stress on the family unit. Clearly, education is of huge importance in keeping children safe, and I think one of the positive changes going forwards could be greater awareness and respect for the work of schools and you as school staff in this area. You might have thought of other ways in which the past few months may have been experienced as traumatic for some of your pupils. I will be very clear at this point that not all our young people are going through trauma. Some children, including those with SEN, will have had a lovely experience and will bounce happily back into school. However, some children will have had a more traumatic time, and for some of these young people, there may be longer-term consequences. Let's look now at some of the symptoms of trauma. A period of shock and denial can be very typical immediate reactions to a traumatic event. Over time, these emotional responses may fade, but there may also be longer-term reactions, such as anger, persistent feelings of sadness and despair, flashbacks, unpredictable emotions, physical symptoms such as nausea and headaches, intense feelings of guilt as though the person is somehow responsible for what happened, an altered sense of shame, and feelings of isolation and hopelessness. Those young people displaying these symptoms are the ones needing the right support around them. We know from our understanding of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, that some children do not just bounce back and instead will need some additional support. Those young people most severely affected by the pandemic will not find it easy to settle to learn, and we must expect their psychological distress to manifest in their behaviour. We know from research that chronic stress disrupts the nervous system. Those children who have experienced a traumatic time may be jumpy, volatile, hypervigilant, and still operating in survival mode. They can be easily triggered into fight or flight mode. Others may appear dazed, tuned out, and their response indicates a freeze way of coping with chronic stress, dissociating to retreat from a frightening and unpredictable outside world. All of these may be seen in traumatized young people, and you may be familiar with some of this already. As a psychologist, I can't talk about trauma without also talking about self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is your belief in your ability to cope, how much control you feel you have over your world and the things that happen to you, how much you can affect a situation and successfully navigate your experiences. Another quick activity for you. How good are you at coping? Rate yourself along this scale as to how good you are at coping. When things get tough, when you experience challenges or even trauma, how likely are you to cope well and recover well and get on with your life? We will return to this later. Trauma is partly about perception. Many experiences have the potential to be perceived as traumatic. It is important to be clear that the same experience may be considered as traumatic for one person, but not for another. The way people view themselves has an impact on how they experience trauma. Belief in one's own ability to cope matters. To illustrate this point, there was a famous Australian experiment done in 2011 by Adam Brown, with staggering results. In this experiment, participants were initially told that, following a battery of psychological tests, they were revealed by these tests to be either below average copers who lacked control or confidence when dealing with adverse and stressful life events, or extremely adept copers, able to recover quickly from traumatic experiences. This was based on nothing more than random selection and nothing to do with the actual psychological test results. Participants then had to watch a 10-minute long disturbing video about a car crash with a fatality. Following this, they were asked to close their eyes and relax for 3 minutes, then estimate the number of times the film's sounds and images intruded on their consciousness during this interlude and the level of distress the film made them feel. Those who were labelled good copers experienced significantly fewer intrusions or nasty thoughts than those who had been labelled, completely by chance, as poor copers. Simply telling people that they were good or bad at handling stressful events changed their response. Some students were plagued with graphic images of the accident because they expected to experience them. Participants were then told the details of the experiment and that the labels were completely random. But what was perhaps the most shocking but important thing about this experiment was that 24 hours later, the researchers contacted each participant and noted that those labelled poor copers, remember this was completely by chance rather than because they actually had weaker coping skills, these participants were still showing higher distress levels and intrusive thoughts about the video they'd seen, including recalling more of the grisly details with accuracy. Concerningly, the results were still this way a full year later. They had actually become poorer copers as a result of having received that label. It is thought that responses to trauma may vary so dramatically from person to person as a result of this, people's belief in their own ability to cope. Feeling helpless may be associated with prolonged suffering after some traumatic event. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I feel crazy. I'm never going to feel the same way I did before. There's something permanently damaged. These symptoms will last forever. These sorts of messages to the self are more likely to elevate feelings of distress and lead on to more problematic outcomes such as PTSD, which we'll talk about in a moment. The way people think about what has happened to them also has an impact. Thinking it was entirely within or entirely not within their control, rather than taking a more balanced view that sometimes things happen that we cannot control, but what we can control is how we respond to it. Finally, the way people think about the world can have an impact on how likely they are to suffer or recover well. Is the world largely a fair and predictable place where frightening things are rare? Or is it believed to be a place of chaos and negativity where bad things will happen more regularly than is actually the case? The way trauma survivors think about themselves, their trauma, and the world is believed to have a big impact on how well they cope and move on. We have become more aware over time of the importance of not labelling young people. Labels can stick and become an integral part of how that young person sees themselves and how they therefore behave. We can, of course, use this to our advantage by telling young people helpful messages about themselves. Messages such as, distressing symptoms are normal and you will eventually recover from them, are simple but effective and key to building resilience. Telling young people they can cope becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. There are things we cannot change about a person or situation that might make somebody more vulnerable to the effects of trauma, but something we do seem to be able to help people develop is their self-efficacy. Self-efficacy has a strong link with resilience, which we will talk more about later. Research has begun to suggest some ways in which we can develop self-efficacy, including the following. First, identifying personal strengths. An intervention called 7 Roses was tested on refugees in Amsterdam who were suffering mental health problems relating to traumatic experiences. The focus was on improving the individual's belief in their ability to find a path through their problems by identifying hopeful messages and personal strengths. The results saw improvements in self-efficacy for many of the participants. Another way to improve self-efficacy is to reflect on obstacles and what can be done to beat them. A 2016 study was done with health and social workers in America who were regularly exposed to troubling situations and what is known as secondary traumatic stress, which comes about through hearing about other people's traumas, something for your pastoral staff to be aware of. They were asked to reflect on the obstacles that sapped them of psychological resilience and to develop strategies for overcoming them. Again, the results were positive in that self-efficacy was improved, which in turn reduced stress. A final way to improve self-efficacy could be by imagining future obstacles and thinking about how you will address them. A study currently in hand is with staff in the emergency departments of hospitals who are being asked to recall instances in which they overcame adversity, to identify factors that allow them to do so, to imagine future stress points they may encounter, and to think through the specifics of how they will solve them. This is expected to improve their belief in their ability to cope with problems, their self-efficacy. These are all cognitive strategies that work by developing self-awareness, mental flexibility, and problem-solving skills. Things you are very capable of doing in schools and do a lot of anyway. When we return to school, it will be about an increased focus on these things as such helpful coping strategies. To a large extent, we can change the way we think, which changes the way we view ourselves, which improves our self-efficacy and overall resilience. For some young people, the Covid-19 response will have been experienced as traumatic. For some parents too, and perhaps for some of the staff in your setting, but not for all of them. We'll move on next to something a very small minority of children will experience. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a step up from having experienced a traumatic event. It is an anxiety disorder only recognised formally as recently as the 1980s. It involves some of the symptoms described in the earlier slide, but to a greater degree and over a longer period of time. It often involves flashbacks or nightmares and can result in regressive behaviours, so children appear younger than they are. It is now thought to be caused by a combination of having experienced something very stressful, frightening, or distressing, combined with having some personal vulnerability. One of the elements of personal vulnerability that is thought to be related to whether someone will go on to develop PTSD is their level of resiliency. Only a minority of people go on to experience PTSD. One study showed it was around 8% of men and 20% of women who have experienced traumatic stresses. So it is not inevitable or guaranteed following a traumatic experience. Also, many of those people who develop symptoms of PTSD following a significant experience will find these symptoms go away on their own over time, around 80% of cases. There is no straightforward relationship between the severity of the trauma and the impact on the individual. There is a really complex interplay of factors. However, there is evidence to suggest that by priming people to view themselves as trauma sufferers, we may actually be increasing their chances of developing PTSD. Something we can feel in control over is the development of resilience, which can help act as a buffer for people to deal better with traumatic experiences. The goal of improving self-efficacy is for a person who experiences a potentially traumatic event to not walk away from it feeling so helpless that they might then unravel if PTSD symptoms arise. Believing that they have it within themselves to overcome an incident could, in itself, raise the chances of them doing so. Recovery from trauma. Here is a link to an internet article I'd like you to read when you get the opportunity, called The Rise of PTSD. I have read directly from this article for some of the previous slides. The key themes in this article are about the ways in which those people who experience trauma view themselves, the trauma, and the future, covering some of the things we have just talked about. The majority of people experiencing something traumatic will recover fine within the context of a warm and supportive social network. The most important thing upon our return to schools is for school to function for children as the brick parent, secure base, the safe haven. This quote from Mary Meredith from the Times Educational Supplement sums it up. Of course, all children will benefit from immersion in the warmth of a relational culture after the deep rupture of Covid-19. I will talk more in the next session about general strategies for ensuring this happens. This too is interesting, that talking over and over about the traumatic experience is not actually helpful and can sometimes make things worse. People can get very stuck in how they are viewing things, and it can then seem really hard to know how best to move them forwards. We can get into the self-fulfilling prophecies mentioned earlier. People develop their labels for who they are, then find others who identify with them and can stay stuck in that role. Somebody experiencing post-traumatic stress needs helpful ways of managing what is happening for them, which involves the way we talk with them, the language we use, and our whole school ethos. The attitude can be more about this experience having been one chapter in a whole book, rather than the whole story. The potential for schools to heal traumatized children or prevent an escalation of need is huge. The final thing I'm going to say about trauma is relating to expectation. Neuroscience research suggests that we are all programmed to predict or expect things to happen. This is a way of making sense and order out of the huge amount of information presented on a minute-by-minute basis to our brains. We find rules and patterns and make assumptions about things to help save time and energy processing all the incoming information. It is automatic and largely outside our conscious awareness for most of the time. There are 2 points relating to expectation and trauma. Firstly, the way in which survivors expect things to happen. And secondly, the way in which we as the adults in the young person's life expect them to behave. This again is about a self-fulfilling prophecy. We get more of what we look for, and we look for what we believe. For example, if young people who have experienced a traumatic time believe that things will be overwhelming, that they are somehow broken or weak, and that they may never feel better again, they will see evidence all the time to prove these beliefs right. Any evidence to the contrary will be quickly dismissed. Young people may need help to find other ways to view their situation and to develop their self-efficacy. And, for example, if we as adults believe that the Covid-19 pandemic will lead to trauma and that it will take a long time to recover, if at all, then we are biased to look for evidence to prove we are right. We see what we believe. We need to take a more balanced approach and view our young people with hope and positivity. We've already mentioned that labels matter. In the clinical world, where PTSD is described as a chronic condition, people are far less likely to take steps in their life to help them master their fears, help them overcome their symptoms, and get their life back on track. Our brains are actually very capable of overcoming trauma with the right support. This includes a helpful and hopeful attitude that change is possible. Nick Haslam, an Australian psychologist, states that expectancy is so powerful. In the case of trauma, expectations about how you'll react or what sort of things are overwhelming, or your views about time to recover or whether you need third-person help, all those things matter. How could they not? He goes on to say that once being a sufferer of trauma becomes part of your identity, it's very hard to let go of. Your sense of self is wrapped up in it, and your community is wrapped up in it. Research evidence suggests that identifying strongly with one's trauma and viewing it as a central event in your life may prevent recovery and make it likely one will suffer from prolonged PTSD symptoms and other mental health problems. We therefore need to think very carefully about what we are expecting from young people when we return to school and over the first few weeks, and how that will shape what we look for and see. The same for our young people. Of course, what we expect comes from what we believe, and your beliefs about trauma can change, for example, through learning about the things we have just discussed. Our pupils can cope and will cope with our support, and so too will we. Okay, so the key points to take away from what we have discussed about trauma and self-efficacy are the fact that we all respond differently to situations. What will be experienced as traumatic to one person may not to another. And the COVID-19 lockdown period will have involved different experiences for different people. Some will have been traumatic, many will have not. And not all trauma leads to PTSD. Most people who are exposed to trauma do not develop the condition. Some children going through trauma may experience negative consequences, and those are the ones we need to be particularly mindful of during this time. If we believe children will be traumatized, we will look for signs of this and likely find what we are looking for. Let's instead be looking for all the signs that young people are coping well and reinforce this. Traumatic responses are also related in part to our self-efficacy, the belief that we can cope. Being told or telling themselves they are a good coper will help a young person face adversity with resilience. Being told or telling themselves they are not a good coper will inevitably result in distress and suffering. Labels matter, the ones we give ourselves and other people. They become self-fulfilling prophecies, and we can use this to our advantage by helping young people view themselves as capable and coping. We are going to talk now about anxiety, which is something you are much more likely to see evidence for upon our return to schools. This is something we can reasonably expect and will therefore need to prepare for. Not every child and young person is going to be experiencing anxiety, but it is very likely some will, and those with existing anxiety difficulties may have heightened anxiety during this time. So, what is anxiety? It is a word we use to describe feelings of unease, worry, and fear. It incorporates both the emotions and the physical sensations we might experience when we are worried or nervous about something. And it is not all bad. Although we usually find it unpleasant, anxiety is related to the fight or flight response, which is of course our normal biological reaction to feeling threatened, so it is not necessarily a bad thing. It can help prepare us or motivate us. A little bit of anxiety is protective. So, why are we expecting to see more anxiety when we return to school? Well, because anxiety is naturally raised during periods of change and transition. It naturally kicks in when there are unexpected events, unpredictable times ahead, or uncertainty in our daily routines, including not knowing what to expect or not being clear what others might expect from us. And of course, it is naturally present when there is risk of illness or even death for ourselves or loved ones. Even if young people haven't directly experienced the illness or death of a loved one from coronavirus, they will almost certainly have been aware of the news in some form and of the restrictions on their normal lifestyle, which can be experienced in a similar way to a grieving process. So based on what we know about child development and human behaviour, we as psychologists are predicting higher levels of anxiety in some of our young people for some time when returning to school life. Another activity for you. Thinking about some of the young people you know. What types of things might these students be worried about when returning to your school? Pause the presentation and jot down some ideas, and we'll come back to discuss these next training session. What are the different types of anxiety we might need to be aware of? There are panic attacks, shown through such things as shaking, hyperventilating, crying, palpitations, and chest pain. There's social anxiety, shown through blushing, sweating, headaches, shortness of breath, nausea, and lightheadedness. There's obsessive compulsive disorder, shown through repetitive behaviours or other evidence of intrusive thoughts, such as being detached, irritable, tense, or distressed. There's agoraphobia, the fear of not being able to get to somewhere safe and therefore fearing being in open spaces. There's generalized anxiety, the constant worry about different things, always feeling tense and on edge. There's post-traumatic stress disorder, as we discussed earlier. There are specific phobias such as animals, heights, blood, etc. And stress. It is important to note that any of these may also be present for ourselves and our colleagues, so being aware of them can help with our own self-care and that of our peers. The reason anxiety can feel so overwhelming for a person is that it affects everything. A person's thoughts are affected in that they are likely to have negative or unhelpful thoughts, such as predicting the worst. People often start to worry a lot about situations and may have a lot of what if type thoughts. A person's behaviour is also affected, so that people end up putting things off because they seem too difficult, avoiding situations, becoming fidgety, or using a whole range of what are called safety behaviours to try to manage their anxious feelings. Safety behaviours are protective, but they actually prevent growth by stopping the person taking proactive steps to confront and overcome their anxiety, and they may cause other problems too, such as affecting relationships or learning. People also experience physical sensations of anxiety, so that they may feel tense or on edge, have an increased heart rate, problems with concentrating, needing the toilet, feeling very sweaty, hot or cold. Finally, anxiety affects a person's emotions, so that their mood is changed, becoming tense, impatient, or irritable. What can often appear as anger in some people is often underlying anxiety being expressed in a way that feels more in control for that person. Let's look at thoughts and behaviours in a bit more detail now to help clarify what we mean by anxiety and to give us the groundwork for what we will need to understand for cognitive behavioural therapy. In cognitive behavioural therapy, anxious thoughts are called NATs or ants, so negative automatic thoughts or automatic negative thoughts, and we all have them from one time to another. Examples include, I'm going to fail, I can't cope, people must think I'm stupid, other people are doing so much better than me. The key characteristics of these types of thoughts are that they are automatic. We don't think them on purpose. They come into our minds involuntarily. They are also believable, so they seem very real at the time. They are, by their very nature, unhelpful. They're negative. They are the kind of thoughts that would be upsetting to anybody. Finally, they are distorted. They are not actually accurate reflections of reality, but based instead on how we feel at the time. It's important to note that some of the thoughts we have that seem negative may actually be quite helpful. To give an example, when coming to do this presentation, it's the first time I've done a presentation in this way, some more negative thoughts popped into my mind around, what if the technology doesn't work? What if my mouth gets dry and I can't speak properly? What if my children need me while I'm in the middle of presenting? What if people don't understand or enjoy the training? Well, the important thing to distinguish is whether the thought you're having is a problem or a worry. If it's a problem or a potential problem, you can do something about it. So in my examples, what if the technology doesn't work? Well, I spent some time preparing in advance. I checked my laptop was charged, I practiced recording an audio to check it worked, made sure the PowerPoint was complete. My seemingly anxious thought about technology helped me prepare and make it more likely that things would go smoothly. Some of my other anxious thoughts were also about potential problems. So the concern my mouth would go dry and I wouldn't be able to speak, I prepared for that possibility by having a glass of water ready and taking regular sips. And my concern that my children would need me while I was presenting. Well, I prepared for that eventuality by being very clear with my partner that I mustn't be disturbed for the next hour and a half. And that means if I was interrupted, I would know it's an emergency and then I would have to act on it. These were potential problems I thought about in advance. They were things I could do something about. The anxious thoughts helped me prepare. The last two anxious thoughts I mentioned were different. I was worried people wouldn't understand or enjoy my training. To the best of my abilities, I have tried to ensure this presentation is accessible and done my best to make it as enjoyable as possible, but ultimately this is out of my control. Whether my presentation is understood and enjoyed is now over to you. That responsibility is yours, not mine. I have done the best I can using my anxious thoughts to motivate me to prepare well, but any further thinking about your enjoyment would be worrying rather than helpful. When your thoughts stop being about a problem you can solve, or a potential problem you can plan for and solve, they stop being helpful, as in the ones described on the slide. Before we move on, look back at the first activity you did, considering the thing you are most worried about in returning to school. Now, consider whether this is a problem that you can solve or a worry you can do nothing about. If you're unsure, you could ask someone you trust and respect. If it's a problem, you can set about trying to solve it. If it's something you have little control over, you can manage the worry using strategies, and we'll talk about some healthy coping strategies later. As well as individual thoughts, which we all have from time to time, people can have more general unhelpful thinking styles. Examples of these include black and white or dichotomous thinking, so seeing only one extreme or the other, nothing in between, no grey area. Overgeneralizing, so seeing a pattern based on just one event and using that to make assumptions and expectations about the future. Mind reading, so assuming you know what another person is thinking. Fortune telling, so predicting what is going to happen. Shoulds and musts, rules you have for yourself or other people. I must do this. I should be able to do that. Having a mental filter, so only paying attention to the negative things and not the positive. And the final one we're going to mention today is compare and despair. So seeing only good things in other people and bad things in yourself. So comparisons with others ends up making you just feel bad. Another activity for you now. Can you think of something a person might say that suggests they are thinking in each of these ways? Either something you or a colleague might say at work, or something a pupil might say. Try and think of an example for each of those unhelpful thinking styles of things you might overhear in school. And I'll share some examples of these next training session. Let's now look at anxious behaviours, so what people do when feeling anxious. When we feel anxious, it is natural to want to do whatever we can to feel better. Often we will still go into the situations that make us feel anxious. However, we will do certain things to reduce the anxiety. An example of this is if you arrive at a party or a training course or similar where you don't know anyone and you may feel a bit nervous about talking to new people. You may get your phone out of your pocket or bag and start scrolling through as though you are reading an important email, or have to suddenly go outside and make a call. We call these things examples of safety behaviours. They're behaviours that make you feel safer in the moment and therefore less anxious. But long term, they prevent you from gaining the valuable experiences that will help you to overcome the anxiety by seeing that you can cope. They also mean that you start to rely on them and feel that you wouldn't have coped if you hadn't used the safety behaviour. Thank goodness I had my phone with me. My phone helped me cope. I must make sure I always have my phone on me. Here is another activity to bring to life some of what we've just discussed. Here's a table for you to complete. Fill in the end column with what sort of behaviour you might see in order to protect against feeling anxiety. There are no right or wrong answers. People have lots of creative ways often to avoid feeling anxious. See if you can think of some behaviours that might take place in each scenario that help that person feel better in the moment. Again, I will share some examples next training session. Those safety behaviours are there to make us feel better and to temporarily reduce the anxiety. But they don't help us in the long term as we're not learning to overcome our fears or to develop skills. Some healthier ways to manage anxiety that don't involve avoidance include the following. You might have some other ideas too of healthy ways to manage anxiety. There are lots of resources out there to give more information about these things, and we'll talk in more detail next session using one specific resource that you can use in school that is based on a really strong evidence base of a healthy way to manage anxiety. So when does anxiety become a mental health problem and of greater concern to us in schools? Well, because anxiety is a normal human experience, it's sometimes hard to know when it's becoming a problem. But if feelings of anxiety are very strong, or last for a long time, or are starting to interfere with living a normal life, it can be overwhelming. For example, a person might find that they're worrying all the time, perhaps about things that are a regular part of everyday life, or about things that aren't likely to happen, or even worrying about worrying. A person might regularly experience unpleasant physical and psychological effects of anxiety and maybe panic attacks. And depending on the kind of problems experienced, a person might be given a diagnosis of a specific anxiety disorder. There is more guidance available on this on the Mind website. The link is shown here. For the majority of our young people, they may experience anxiety without it being at the level of a diagnosable anxiety disorder. The resources we will discuss next session will be helpful for the majority of students, as well as those with more challenging anxious thoughts. We're going to move on from talking about anxiety now and look at a protective factor that can be helpful in overcoming anxious and stressful situations: resilience. Resilience. This is essentially our response to obstacles. We want our young people to have a resilient mindset so they feel they can get through this next few months with the right attitude, tools, and support. I also want you to feel resilient so that you feel able to return to school and cope with what the next few months has in store. So let's look at one theory of resilience and how it applies to you and your young people. This theory of resilience says that resilience is made up of three components: a sense of mastery, a sense of connectedness, and emotion regulation. Let's look at each of these briefly in turn. A sense of mastery. This is essentially a person's self-belief. It's made up of optimism, so having positive attitudes about life and the world; self-efficacy, which we've already discussed as the individual's belief that they are capable and able to solve problems that come their way; and finally, adaptability, a person's ability to ask for help and to learn from their mistakes. Note that resiliency here isn't about having all the skills, tools and answers already. It's about feeling able to gain them along the way and to make best use of what you already have. And as we've already discussed, a person's self-efficacy can be developed, along with their sense of optimism and their adaptability. Second, resilience includes a sense of connectedness. So this is the ability to trust others, to gain support and comfort from them, and to build helpful relationships through being tolerant of other people. Note here that resiliency isn't necessarily about getting through things alone. It also includes the skills of asking for and receiving help from trusted others, and to be able to get along with other people. We'll talk more next time about how to create a supportive atmosphere for when children return to schools. And the final strand of resilience is emotion regulation, the ability to understand and manage a range and intensity of emotional experiences, bouncing back and not having your life overly negatively affected by your emotions. Clearly, for some young people, this is going to be a highly emotional time, and those with poor emotion regulation skills will likely find it much more challenging. Note here that resiliency isn't about not feeling worried, afraid, sad, or angry. Instead, it's about understanding and recognizing these feelings and knowing how best to manage them safely and effectively in a way that validates what you're experiencing without making things worse for yourself or other people. Just like the skills within sense of mastery and sense of connectedness, so too can emotion regulation skills be developed and improved. We'll talk more about that in our next section on cognitive behavioural therapy. It is possible to heal from emotional and psychological trauma. We know the brain changes in response to trauma, but we also know that interventions can help the brain change again to leave the trauma behind and to feel safe again. The same with anxiety. Just because you experience anxiety, it doesn't mean you are, in inverted commas, an anxious person. Remember the self-fulfilling prophecy. The brain can change and you can become less anxious in your responses over time. Resiliency is something that can be developed by targeting each of those components to help our young people face the future with self-belief and competence. It is important to highlight that they are skills and they need to be practiced. To borrow an analogy from a colleague, it is like having a gym membership. Just having a gym membership isn't going to get you stronger or fitter or more toned or feeling better within yourself. You actually have to go to the gym and work out and stick to a program. The same with resiliency skills. Just knowing about them isn't enough. Just teaching our young people about them isn't enough. They actually need practicing so that those resiliency muscles get stronger. And that means our young people will be better able to face challenge in future as they will have developed the skills they need. This is a long-term journey, not just something that can be taught in a one-off session. And we'll talk more about that next training session when we're talking about whole school approaches. Another activity for you now. So in terms of your own resiliency, which of these areas are your strongest and which could use a little more exercise? Can you think of a person who shows good skills in the area that you want to improve? One way to support our own development is to think about someone who is already good at something we want to be better at and try to be more like this person. What do they do? What do they say? How do they behave? How do they react? Try and visualize somebody you admire or respect really clearly, and over the next few weeks make a concerted effort to be more like them in that particular skill area. Okay, to sum up this section on anxiety and resilience, the key messages for you to take away are as follows. That anxiety is not necessarily a bad thing. It can help us prepare for potential problems. It becomes less helpful when it involves worrying and stops us doing things to help ourselves or live our normal lives. Not all children will experience anxiety when returning to school, and certainly not at a concerning level. For some, this will have all been a fantastic experience, or just neutral. But some children will experience anxiety to a greater degree and may engage in safety behaviours that interfere with their learning or their relationships and behaviour, and these children will need extra support. We can help children become more resilient by improving their self-efficacy, the belief that they can help themselves rather than suffer. By giving them the message that distressing symptoms are normal and that they will recover, that they have more control over their emotions than they think, and that these muscles need exercising, are all helpful messages. And finally, that they can cope and will cope with our support. We can also improve resilience by helping to develop relationships and the ability to manage emotions. So following on from this, let's talk about one way to better manage emotions with a really strong evidence base. That is cognitive behavioural therapy. Cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT, is a combination of what we think and what we do to help improve things. It was developed by Aaron Beck in the 1960s and is a problem-focused and action-orientated therapy, meaning it concentrates solely on the issue at hand rather than ones from the past. So what is the current problem? And it relies on the person doing things rather than just talking about things. CBT is a recognised evidence-based intervention for anxiety and trauma and is used for many different mental health concerns. It is a popular modern intervention, but actually has its roots in Stoic philosophy, which is a school of thought dating back 2,500 years. The purpose of this training is around supporting pupils on their return to school, so our focus is on anxiety, which will be present for some of our pupils. CBT is a really helpful way of understanding anxiety and how to challenge it. I'd like you to now watch a short video produced by the mental health charity Mind. Hopefully you'll be able to copy the link on the screen and paste it into your web browser so the video loads up directly. If not, apologies, but you may have to copy it down and type it in for yourself. Or if you type "making sense of CBT video" into your search engine, it should also come up. The video is a really easy to follow and clear guide to what CBT is and does, and it lasts around 3.5 minutes. So if you'd like to pause the presentation, you can watch that video and come back to me once you've done. Okay, see you soon. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully the video worked for you and gave you a helpful introduction to CBT. The foundation of CBT, and something that can be quite challenging to get your head around, and certainly for some young people to get their heads around, is that it is the thoughts we have about things, not the things themselves, that trouble us. The way we think about situations can affect the way we behave. We've already touched on this when talking about self-efficacy and believing ourselves either to be good or poor copers. We can't control what other people say and do, or what goes on around us, but we can control the way we react to them. It may not feel it at the time, but this is again a skill that can be practiced. Your self-control muscle can get stronger. This image is called the hot cross bun and shows the different areas of focus in CBT and how they are all related. Triggers in the environment make us think certain things, which trigger feelings and emotions, and we respond to those experiences by behaving in certain ways. We can get into cycles of behaving, and CBT helps us break these cycles to change our behaviour and improve our mood, all through changing the way we think. Also, the way our body feels at a certain time may trigger thoughts which may not be entirely accurate. For example, when you're feeling hungry or tired or a bit poorly, you may be quick to blame others for your irritability. It is that child's fault for being annoying, that person's fault for not getting back to me quickly enough, that driver's fault for driving too close. When actually we are just being less patient and tolerant because our body isn't in a comfortable state. In the world of neuroscience, our body and brain are intricately connected so that you can't consider one without the other. CBT raises a person's awareness of their own thoughts and how these are related to the way they feel, the way their body is responding, and the way they behave. It's not about blaming a person for thinking in a certain way or making any sort of critical judgment about the thoughts someone's having. It is just about helping them understand their role in things and how they might be able to respond in ways that they find more helpful and less distressing. It's empowering and it gives control to the individual. You can change how you feel and how you respond and how you cope with things. You have that power. CBT is about trying out different ways of thinking, and this will create new brain pathways that will get stronger with practice, so that eventually these ways of thinking become what you believe. CBT also involves trying out different ways of behaving that will challenge the automatic negative thoughts and any unhelpful beliefs you might have about yourself or your experiences or the world. CBT also encourages strategies to make those physical sensations feel more under your control through relaxation strategies. It's not saying you can think your way out of feeling tired, hungry, or unwell, or that you should just think happy thoughts to get out of a low mood, or stop worrying to get out of an anxious state. These can be dangerous assumptions, as they can be really invalidating of a person's experience. Instead, it's about using what we know about our thoughts, feelings, and behaviours to improve our situation in the moment. CBT isn't all about thoughts. We can't underestimate the importance of sleep, diet, and exercise. The philosophy behind CBT is that you have the ability and responsibility to respond the way you choose. You're able to maintain control through thought exercises because we have a rational as well as an emotional part of our brain. We are not entirely controlled by our emotions. We have the ability to think about thinking and to reflect on our own behaviours, and this makes us unique in the animal world. We are all much better at coping than we might initially think we are. It's all about perception and challenging our expectations. We will look next time at a specific intervention based on this to help our young people manage their thoughts, feelings and behaviours, which will hopefully make all of this theory clearer and more relevant to your young people. Okay, to summarise what we've just learnt about CBT, firstly, that CBT teaches the person to become more aware of their thoughts and beliefs about their experiences and gives them skills to react to emotional triggers in a healthier way. CBT is all about focusing on what you have control over. It is important to focus on what is under your control. There are practical steps you can take to change the way you feel. This is good because feeling helpless might be associated with prolonged suffering. Importantly, CBT believes that it is your reactions rather than the experiences themselves which cause the suffering. If we can change the way we think about an experience, we can change the way we feel about it and behave in healthier, happier ways. And finally, CBT helps people take responsibility. It may be our own internal, biological state or ways of thinking that are making us feel bad, not other people or events. We have the power to change this to help us feel more in control of what is happening for us. The same for our young people. In the next session, we're going to talk about broad strategies to help children re-engage with education after this pandemic. There will also be a specific CBT-based anxiety intervention called the Anxiety Gremlin. We've now come to the end of the theory I wanted to share with you today. So let's run through the headlines from this training, the key points I'd like you to take away with you for today. First, that some of our pupils will have experienced trauma during the pandemic. Second, that some will have heightened anxiety upon their return to school. Third, that schools can provide excellent support to help pupils cope with these experiences. Recovery is proactive, and returning to the gym membership analogy, we'll need to help our pupils practice their resiliency skills. How our pupils think about themselves and their experiences will affect how well they will cope. The way we label our young people can have a dramatic effect on whether they consider themselves able and competent or not. And finally, that we can change the way our pupils think, which will affect how they feel and behave. And more on this next time. Let's return now to the activity we did near the start. How good are you at coping? Based on what you've learned throughout this training, how would you now rate yourself on this scale? Hopefully more towards the extremely adept coper side on the right. The way you think affects what you see and do. What you believe about yourself shapes who you are. I believe that you are all able to really successfully support young people back into your setting. Thank you for listening to this presentation. It's the first time I've delivered training in this way, so I really hope you've been able to gain something helpful from it. I've certainly learned a lot, and I really look forward to speaking with you again next time. Goodbye.